I often find myself coming back to that story that Rebecca tells about her early Methodist ministry, because for me, Cecil is a model of a church member who remembers what a church is for, who keeps, we might say, his eyes on the prize, doesn't let himself get distracted by the kinds of petty fights that can happen, and maybe not so petty fights that can happen in congregations, but digs deep and remembers the foundational commitments of what a church is like, and in his case, of course, what a Christian church is all about. He remembers what is most deeply right rather than what is easy or comfortable. A church guided by something larger than personal happiness or individual preferences of ministers or fear of offending someone. A church is a church whose decisions are guided by whether and how well they serve the mission of the church. And so I want to share some thoughts with you this morning about how and why the ideas of mission and covenant are so important, especially in our Unitarian Universalist tradition. The Swiss Protestant theologian Emil Brunner famously wrote once that the church exists by mission, just as a fire exists by burning. Churches are called into existence by the people who found them. Maybe some of you here are founding members of this congregation, I don't know. But a congregation comes together because of a deeply felt need. And we have to ask ourselves, what particular kind of mission describes the liberal church? Why do churches, congregations like this exist at all? What is the goal of our existence as a religious movement, not just in this congregation, but in UU congregations around the country and around the world? What are we gathered here to do, to accomplish? What is our vision? We're gathered here, after all, in a particular kind of religious community, one that represents a tradition that goes back 250 years in America on both the Unitarian and the Universalist side, and back to the 1750s, in other words, and traces an even longer kinship with liberal religion in Poland and Transylvania going back to the 1560s, 450 years ago. That is the heritage of liberal faith that we embody here and in UU congregations like this one around the country, around the world. We in the Unitarian Universalist tradition have a long history of using our precious freedom to challenge old habits, old beliefs, old creeds, old cultures. I would guess that when you discovered a UU church for the first time, either here or elsewhere, you may have experienced it as I did in my first UU congregation, with a burst of openness and eagerly breathing in the air of freedom that we so rightly cherish in our liberal religious tradition. But it's not about you or me. It's not all about freedom. My question for you this morning, one of my questions, is not what our liberal religious tradition gives to us, but what that tradition demands of us. What it takes to be a really good, faithful religious liberal, faithful to our best selves, faithful to this religious tradition that some of our forebears suffered and died for. In other words, not how do we think about liberal faith, but how do we live by it day by day, year by year. Now, there may be some tendency to think that that's a pretty easy task. After all, in our religious tradition, we don't have a uniform creed to live up to, despite what the government of Louisiana says. We're not required to obey the Ten Commandments, although they're mostly pretty good ideas. And I think there's a tendency for us to imagine that our more open-ended approach to religious questions demands less of us than more conservative churches do. Is that right? Is that really right? Do liberals have it easier than conservatives? Paul Rasor, one of our leading UU theologians these days, and for the past 20 years actually, in his book, Faith Without Certainty, has this to say: liberal theology is not for the faint of heart. It points us in a general direction without telling us the specific destination. It refuses to make our commitments for us, but holds us accountable for the commitments that we do make. The liberal religious tradition is an invitation, not a mandate. It invites us to live with ambiguity, to engage in dialogue without trying to control the conversation, and to be engaged in the culture without succumbing to the culture's values. Liberal religion calls us to strength without rigidity, conviction without ideology, openness without laziness. It asks us to pay attention. It is an eyes wide open faith, a faith without certainty. If some of you zoomed into our General Assembly a couple of weeks ago, you may have heard some of these same ideas being lifted up for visibility at the General Assembly. Kim Crawford Harvey, in her Berry Street essay, spoke about our refusal of cheap certainty. Meg Riley, one of our co-moderators of the Unitarian Universalist Association, acknowledged, quote, living in a pluralistic community is far from easy. And our UUA president, Sophia Betancourt, spoke of the core inheritances that live at the heart of our faith and must never change. But Paul Rasor suggests that there are pitfalls that we need to be careful to avoid, that living by liberal faith isn't as easy as it might seem at first glance. Some of these pitfalls we can laugh at. One commonly cited danger is that liberals are people who are too broad-minded to take up their own side in an argument. But other pitfalls are more serious. Freedom, after all, is a tricky value, one that can easily degenerate into license or dysfunctional individualism, or just following the impulses of the moment or doing whatever you feel like doing, to put one's individual preferences and passions over the need of the community and the common good. We must continually ask ourselves, freedom from what and freedom for what? And the question of freedom for what leads directly into the idea and the importance of mission. I looked on your website, the nvuu.org website, because I was interested in finding a mission statement for your congregation. And I have to confess, I have to tell you that I didn't find one. But you do have, so I asked Susan, your minister, and she said, oh yes, we have a vision statement and a mission statement, and she sent them to us. The vision statement comes from 2001, so it's 23 years old. And it speaks of looking forward to having our own building. Well, that one's a bit outdated, right? Here you are. Congratulations. Yes?
We took out those words by congregational life.
Okay, well, I guess you need to bring Susan up to date on that. But thank you. I'm glad to know that. What I want to say, though, about mission is that the idea of mission is particularly important in a non-creedal church like this. The Methodist church that I read that passage to you about with Rebecca Parker and Cecil and so forth, comes to some extent with a predefined mission by identifying themselves as Christians and identifying the Bible as a sacred text. They have an automatic kind of built-in mission. Unitarian Universalist churches don't have that. We don't have a creed. We are adamantly non-creedal. We don't have any single sacred text, although we find wisdom and holiness in a lot of different written and spoken sources. And part of our mission comes from looking around at the world and seeing that there is work to be done. We see around us a culture of greed, of political corruption, racism and white supremacy. These are problems that call out for our active commitment together as a collective body. And I'm sure as individuals, just as I do, you send money and sign petitions to various organizations that work for political freedom and environmental preservation and all of those kinds of causes that we often are known for. And as a national, even worldwide movement, we talk a lot about the ideal of justice and for living and acting on the side of love. Some of you may have those t-shirts that say "Side with Love." We don't often think of love as a spiritual practice, maybe, but I think maybe it's our most important spiritual practice. We gather, or when we gather here and in UU churches around the world, one of our central questions is, or I hope it is, what in our present situation, in our moment in history, does the Universalist gospel of love call us to do? I remember back 22 years ago, 23 years ago now, 2001, the Sunday after the 9/11 destruction of the World Trade Centers. UU churches across our country were packed with people that next Sunday morning. People who wouldn't ordinarily come to church. People packed seeking, churches packed with people seeking a renewal of hope, some kind of reassurance, or maybe just huddling together for reassurance and comfort. And that's important. Communities provide comfort, the comfort of shared values and ideals. But huddling together can't be all that we do. That's a temporary and understandable reaction when we experience scenes and actions of violence. But our mission statement needs to remind us, needs to have a deeper anchor, needs to remind us of something deeper to hold on to when we are shocked or swayed by the winds of culture that we live in. I remember a few years back when Jerry Brown was still our governor. I think maybe it was his last press conference as governor. He pulled a penny out of his pocket and turned it around and looked on the back where it says "E pluribus unum." And he said, "We have plenty of pluribus, but not a lot of unum." And too often, I think UU congregations can find themselves in the same problem. Our challenge is to build bridges across our diversity, and we are indeed diverse. with different beliefs, different commitments, different passions. And amid all of that diversity, having a clear understanding of what the mission of the church is, what it exists to do, is important, essential, I would say, in discerning and living by liberal faith. Because in the absence of something like a Bible or a creed, the mission is what reminds us of what we're here to do. We have to build bridges between ourselves that span the breadth of our theological diversity, our ideological diversities, our partisan diversities. And so in that spirit, I'm going to, in this middle point of the sermon, going to ask you to sing a song from the Teal hymnal with me, number 1023, Building Bridges. Making sweet harmony. I like that turn of phrase, that idea. It evokes the idea of a band of players, of musicians, a choir or an orchestra. And a couple of years ago, I found this statement from one of our small Northern California UU fellowships. They said this: isolated players are not an orchestra, no matter how excellent they are as soloists. We generate a community greater than the sum of its parts, trustworthy friends, understanding listeners, and thoughtful teammates. We share meanings developed in our individual lives, and we stand together in times of sorrow and joy and challenge. UUs do have a high regard for the integrity of the individual, but individual independence can get out of hand. We are often too much soloists without the kind of discipline that teamwork makes for a good choir or orchestra. And if any of you are players of instruments or singers in a choir, you know what I mean. It's not dependence or independence, but interdependence that makes for a good musical ensemble, and I think also for a congregation of strength and integrity. I remember a story that I heard many years ago about a man who had been trapped on an isolated island in the Pacific, not exactly a desert island. It was a fairly lush island, and he was able to live alone there for several years. And indeed, he kept trying to attract the attention of passing ships with no luck. And after 15 years, finally, some passing ship noticed his desperate attempts to communicate and took a small boat ashore to rescue this man. And the captain and the other members of the crew were curious how he had existed for 15 years on this island. And he led them to a clearing and a little hut, and he said, well, this is where I live. This shelters me from the rain, and I cook my food here and live off the land. And then there were two other larger buildings over at the other edge of the clearing. And he said, well, what's this building over here? And he says, oh, that's my church. That's where I worship every Sunday. Oh, okay, said the captain. And then how about this? This is an even bigger church or even bigger building over here. And what's that one for? And the man said, oh, don't get me started on that. That's the church I used to go to. Well, a friend of mine, Lila Ibrahim, some of you might know the name Lila Ibrahim. She has been a member of the Oakland UU Church for 35 years, maybe 40 years. She's been the RE director. She's served as the board president. She's done almost every kind of job there is to do in the church. And she wrote a reflection, I think maybe 10 years ago, about her experience in being in that church and all of the challenges and frustrations it threw up for her to be a member of that church, when she said she has often been disappointed. I'm disappointed, she said, when people don't think my justice project is the one that we should put our energies into. I'm disappointed when we don't all agree that children's ministry is the most important priority. I am disappointed that people don't give enough time or talent or treasure to the church. And I am disappointed, and she goes on, but you get the idea. And then she says she's been sometimes just so disappointed that she's thought of leaving the church. But staying away, she says, has never helped me through such times. Rather, coming in closer to people, telling people about my spiritual disappointments, listening, sharing, caring, and worshiping have helped me. Because, she says, we are not in church to be with people who want to sing the same music, or rally for the same cause, or attend the same retreats. We are in a church to learn to love better. We disagree, we annoy, we flake out on one another, and we worship, and we support, and we hold, and we affirm one another. This is really there is really only one choice between imperfect community and no community at all. Again and again, we are called to choose to commit ourselves in building a more just, more diverse, and yet ever messy and imperfect beloved community. It was just a little over a century ago, in 1915, that the phrase beloved community was first coined. You may think it goes back to Martin Luther King, but he got it from somebody else. Actually, he got it from philosopher Josiah Royce. And in recent years, a huge number of UU churches have picked up the phrase beloved community and given it an iconic status in our way that we talk about churches. Mostly what we think about maybe is we think of the warmth of community, of friendly togetherness, either at social events or here on Sunday mornings, or offering and receiving comfort from one another in times of sadness and loss. And don't misunderstand, those senses of warmth and comfort are perfectly reasonable and essential aspects of beloved community. But if that's all the farther our sense of beloved community goes, then we risk becoming insular, too much inwardly directed. There's a danger of feeling and seeing the community only as a comfort and a refuge. So how do we, as a congregation, or how does any group of people, a political party, a religious congregation, even a nation, keep itself from worshiping itself? Because we are not here to worship a church. We are here to set our eyes on a vision. And Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who you may know, the author of The Little Prince, once said, "Love does not consist in gazing into one another's eyes, but standing side by side and looking in common out toward an inspiring vision." Churches exist on the basis of covenant. Not only mission, but also covenant. Covenant is a promise to stick together And it's very old on the Unitarian side of our tradition. It's one of the things that we have kept from our Puritan heritage. If you want to know where the idea of covenant comes from in the Unitarian side of our tradition, 1648, the Cambridge Platform. That's, maybe I shouldn't use the word Bible, but that's where the idea of covenant and church togetherness comes from. The idea that churches are gathered by people who promise to walk together. And when the disagreements happen, as they always will, the covenant tells us that we don't pick up our marbles and go home. We stay around. We honor the promises that we have made to the congregation, to the members, to the other people, to stay together and to put faithfulness and love at the center. Some of you know that at our General Assembly 3 weeks ago, we passed a new description of who we are as a religious movement, and putting love at the center of a seven value graphic. I hope some of you have seen that. But love is the center. That's the new statement that 80% of the delegates at General Assembly voted to adopt. Now, I don't agree with St. Paul on a lot of things, but his well-known letter to the people of the Church of Corinth when they were tearing themselves apart over fake fights and petty disagreements, he wrote of faith, hope, and love, saying that the greatest of the three is love. And we in the UU movement have found much reason to affirm that identity. Love is the unifying force underlying and unifying mission with covenant. Hosea Ballou, probably the most important Universalist theologian in our tradition, in 1805 wrote, if we agree in brotherly love, there is no other disagreement that can do us any harm. But if we do not agree in brotherly love, then no other agreement can do us any good. So living by liberal faith, to me, means living in a sacred covenant, a covenant conceived in holiness and guided by mission and linked together by the interdependent web, which is love. We need to be able to keep our eyes on the prize in times of disagreement and remind ourselves, like Cecil was reminded, of the common good, of why the community, the church, exists. We bind ourselves together in relational power with one another under the guidance of our mission. And that's what living faithfully in covenant is all about. So to paraphrase St. Paul, mission, covenant, and love, but the greatest of these is love. I invite you to close our service, or almost close our service, singing hymn number 34 in the gray hymnal.